Hello and welcome to The Society with Barrister Fatma Shaheen at PTB World. Now, unfortunately, the societal attitudes and the mindset that we have towards differently abled persons in Pakistan is inherently problematic. We often see that, parents of children who have, differently abled children, they hide the fact that their children have disabilities because they don't want them to be stigmatized. Similarly, we also see that, differently abled persons themselves, they hide the same too because they don't want to be subjected to discrimination because of their disability. Why do we have such negative stereotypes about differently abled persons and disabilities in Pakistan? This is exactly what we'll be talking about in our today's show. More so, we'll also be shedding light upon the different various positive social developments as they have happened in the Pakistani society, more so in the recent past. How are differently abled persons in Pakistan working to empower and uplift their fellow community members? This is also something that we'll be touching upon during the course of today's conversation. And to do this, I have a very eminent, rather pertinent panel with me here today. Let me introduce you to my today's panel. My first panelist for the show today is Ms. Sana Khurshid, who is a disability rights activist. Assalamu alaikum ji and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum assalam. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
You're most welcome. And my second panelist for the show today is Mr. Ali Chugtai, who's a legal and policy expert. Assalamu alaikum Ali and welcome to the show.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. And my third panelist for the show today is Dr. Taj, who is a psychologist. Assalamu alaikum ji and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum assalam, Fatma.
Sana, I would like to start the show with you. When we talk about disability, some say that it's merely a perception, but we all understand as lawyers that of course it is not. It is something which has parameters. It has something, which has a definition, so to speak. But, coming from somebody who is a differently abled person yourself, how do you see this concept of, disability? Because we all understand the fact that, it's something very subjective. A person might be able-bodied, they might have some kind of a, slight issue with their health, and they might consider themselves to be disabled, but then they are people with very covert disabilities too. So where do you draw that line?
And no matter how many legal definitions we come up with for disability and how many terms we come up with, calling people differently abled, disabled, person with a disability, people with disabilities, the actual fact remains that you need to remember that a person is a person first and the disability comes later.
Of course.
So once you start considering them to be human, once you start taking them as, somebody who deserves the same kind of life, the same kind of rights, the same kind of facilities, opportunities that every other person enjoys in this country, in this world, then you need to, then they start recognize the person for who he is, a person first, a human being first.
Of course, and I think by that yardstick, that's very rightly put by yourself, that, your disability should not be something which should define you. I think you would have something to add to this because we do understand the fact that, in different jurisdictions all over the world, disability is very differently defined, more so when it comes to the psychological angle, because, that's where the gray area comes in, that's where it's more difficult to identify the disability per se. So from your own psychological perspective, how do you define disability more so in the Pakistani context?
So as Sana said, there are different names that we can use when it comes to disability. But if we have to define disability in the medical term, we are going to say that disability is basically a mental or a physical condition that is affecting a person. Due to that condition, the person is going to face limitation in his or her movement, on his or her activities, his or her senses.
Right.
So the idea that we often think that disability could be only physical is, it's not only physical.
That's
it could
very
be
rightly
mental
put
as
by
well.
yourself because, if I might quote, the American Psychiatric Association defines disability to be a persistent psychological illness resulting in, one way or the other, hampering one's educational, social, or for that matter, vocational development. So I think that has a very wide definition to it, and this is something which has to be reported and diagnosed by a mental health professional. So I think for people who actually complain of having disabilities, able-bodied persons, I think the line is very clear. I'll come to you, Ali. I think we must talk about this, in a legal perspective as well, which is why we have you today on the show too, that when we talk about disability, more so from the perspective of laws, how do our laws in Pakistan define disability?
So you have to understand that the concept of disability has evolved over the past 20-25 years drastically.
Right.
Our previous ordinance, or I should say current ordinance, 1981 ordinance, dealt with disability in a very archaic way. And there was no nuance whatsoever. But over the past 20-30 years, we have seen that internationally within sovereign jurisdictions around the world and developed countries and developing countries, the concept of disability has evolved. So there is the UN Convention of Rights for Persons with Disabilities, which a lot of countries have signed and ratified. Pakistan is also one of them. It is a very pertinent piece of legislation that internationally has been seen as a binding instrument towards the parties and countries that have ratified it, and Pakistan is no exception. So basically what happens through that is that there is a uniform conception of disability.
Right.
So what we have now is potentially, as I will dilate upon further as we get into the discussion, but the revised definition of disability that will be applicable towards Punjab will be any person who has a long-term intellectual, physical, sensory or mental impairment that in the long term impairs their ability to partake in the society as a able person would.
So in continuation to what you said, I think we must also delve upon the case victory that you people have had, both you as well as Sana in the Lahore High Court, where you've actually managed to make the court order in your favor so as to have, you know, ramps there, so as to make it more accessible for differently able persons. So tell us that, you know, how did this writ petition come about, and what is the relief that you people had, and what kind of an impact can we expect this decision to make?
Sure. Whenever we would meet at public places, we would notice that you know, there was lack of accessibility, ramps and other provisions that would help persons with disabilities access spaces, especially public spaces.
Right.
So in this regard, we researched existing regulations in this regard, and regulations exist within the Lahore Development Authority, existed in 2018, whereby public buildings were mandated to have provision of ramps and even toilets to facilitate persons with disabilities in terms of the access to the buildings. So regrettably, that had not been complied with. So in 2018, we filed a very narrowly tailored petition seeking for the Lahore High Court to ask and demand LDA to implement those provisions. Regrettably, it didn't amount to much, so we had to evolve our strategy.
Right.
So in 2021, we filed a fresh writ petition, this time before the Honorable Lahore High Court, Lahore, and before Honorable Justice Jawad Hassan, who is a very proactive judge. And we sought for not only the LDA, but other regulatory bodies as well to implement provision of ramps and all areas and facets of life in which persons with disabilities are inconvenienced. So regulations existed, laws existed,
but there was no implementation per se.
Exactly.
So I think we must also talk about, you know, this law on which both of you and of course a lot of other people, other lawyers, human rights activists have also worked, and you've managed to get it approved. So tell us about this law too, because I understand that, you know, this law, once inshallah it gets through, it will be a milestone achievement for differently able persons in Pakistan.
Currently, we are going by the 1981 disability ordinance, and naturally, because of the time frame in which it was legislated, disability rights were very archaic, and it has evolved a lot over the past 30 years. This act is not only a reflection of the evolving rights, but it is in accordance with and compliance with international human rights obligations that Pakistan has, and it places persons with abilities on an equal footing with persons with disabilities. So this doctrine of, you know, separate but equal no longer exists. Persons with disabilities will be accommodated in every facet of life.
In the mainstream, basically.
In the mainstream, whether it's education, employment, accessibility. So you won't have this cherry-made provision whereby they are afforded separate classrooms or separate places of employment, but they will be afforded and accommodated within the same capacity as able persons.
Right, Ali Sahab, your point is noted. But Sana, how do you see this law being implemented in practice? You know, because we all understand the fact that, you know, different people might have different levels of disabilities. So would it not be difficult for somebody who has a very maybe severe kind of a disability to go to a mainstream school and, you know, study? Although of course that is the idea behind the law, and it is something very positive, that is the need of the hour, but then you have to, you know, also take care of such special issues and such special cases too.
See, when we were working on the draft bill, like Dr. Sahiba said, there are a lot of disabilities that are invisible as well. So when we were working on this law, we tried to keep the definition of disability very fluid. So as to, you know, in the future, if ever some different conditions come up which are considered as disabilities, they would be included and they'd be covered by this act as well. So this is the first law which has really defined all the rights that people with disabilities will eventually, inshallah, enjoy once this law is passed. And implementation, like any law, obviously there are people like Ali Chughtai who will make sure these laws are implemented and will fight the good fight for anybody who has any issue. And obviously no piece of document is perfect. There's always room for improvement. But having said that, we've tried to make this law very all-encompassing, very detailed, very comprehensive, and it's not just for, you know, for the protection, it's for empowering people with disabilities as well, to equip them to lead a life like any able-bodied person does. And like you said, that there is a very comprehensive assessment process which a person will go through to be labeled as, you know, whatever disability he or she suffers
I think it clarifies a lot of confusions, you know, which might not have been addressed before, on which I'll come to. I think we must talk about this whole, you know, discussion, this whole conversation that we are having today from a psychological perspective too. You know, a lot of times we see that people who do suffer from disabilities, Sana might be an exception that way, but they don't accept that. And not only them, their families are also out there to kind of hide it, because they feel that, you know, if they tell people, if they are open about it, then their children might be labeled, they might be stigmatized. So as a psychologist yourself, how do you help them overcome this kind of, you know, internalization? Because I think the first step for you, the first challenge for you would be to help them actually accept the fact that, you know, this is a disability, but it should not be considered a disability.
It is a huge challenge, Fatma, basically to treat family members first before the person that is having a disability. As Sana mentioned, the definition of disability is really large. It's really, you know, we should keep that in mind, that disability is not something rigid. You know, we cannot labelize a certain person, okay, with a disability just because that person is having some tick marks. So it's something that is ongoing, and first of all, we need to psychoeducate the family members, explain them what is a disability and how they have to help the person with the disability. Then obviously we have to come to the person that is having a differently that is suffering.
I think psychologists like yourself have a very important role to play then, because then it's just not about treatment, it's also about, you know, social counseling at the end of the day, and it's just not about the patient, it's also about the family per se. So how do you practically, you know, actually give out therapy sessions and counsel such patients and their families, so to speak? Because from what I understand, this is such a difficult task, because, you know, you're just not treating the patient, you're also you know, side by side treating their families too.
So the first challenge that we are going to face is the infrastructure. As both of you mentioned, unfortunately we do not have proper infrastructure where we can welcome properly differently able person. So we cannot have the required number of sessions that we need to have with family members and with the differently able person. But whenever we have that opportunity, it's a real work to make them realize that they have a self-worth. And as Sana mentioned in the beginning of the discussion, the most important thing is to figure out that the person is existing with the without that disability.
And I think the most important realization here, I think something which would also go on to you as well, is to make that person accept the fact that, you know, it's okay not to be okay. Because again, there's so much gray area in this. You need to accept that, you know, just because you have a disability, that doesn't mean that, you know, you are disabled per se. It can also be used as a strength. And I think for that, Sana is our inspiration that way. Sana, but when you talk about infrastructure, and this is something which I'll, you know, be asking Ali as well, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of accessibility of the system, in terms of institutional support as a differently able person in Pakistan, how conducive do you feel the environment to be?
That's a very good question. See, nothing. There was nothing before. I mean, I've had this injury for a long time, and for a person who was not born with a disability, I can see the contrast between life as a able-bodied and as a disabled. So, you know, like she said, a person who has a disability is already going through so much mentally, and, you know, once his family or whatever he himself decides that, okay, now I'm ready to face the world, I'm ready to go live a life, and when he goes out and sees their life is not ready to accept him, this world has not been made for that person. So it is a huge setback. It takes him like 20 steps back. And that is why, you know, we did the petition, we filed that petition because of that. Because I know a ramp is not a solution to all of our problems, but it is symbolic of the fact that building or a public space, it shows that everyone is welcome. So, but you know, on a positive note, I've noticed a huge change in society for what it was 10 years ago and how it is now.
And I think that is because of people like you and so many others I see on social media and mainstream media otherwise, who are actually leading by example that way, you know, advocating all these disability rights movements, filing cases in courts, and then of course having that voice for yourself. But Ali, coming to, I think, a very relevant question in this regard is that when we talk about laws, we understand the fact that laws in any society have that capacity, rather they are promulgated with the intention of improving societal attitudes. So to address all the issues that Sana has very rightly so mentioned, how effective are our laws to do just that?
So first of all, we have to understand that legislative making is a complicated process, and oftentimes there's a paucity of such progressive legislative reforms. So courts in Pakistan, because it's a developing country, have historically stepped in through the avenue of public interest litigation to facilitate litigants like Sana so that they can advocate for progressive reforms. So what the courts end up doing is obviously separation of powers entitles the courts not to be a legislative body, but they nudge the legislature in the right direction. So they help the legislature in the formation of laws. So we have some really fantastic judges in the Lahore High Court and now in the Supreme Court as well, who have advocated for that, and who basically ask for all stakeholders to get together to formulate laws that can enable progressive societal reforms. Such was the case in this draft act. So regarding what you were saying earlier regarding implementation of the laws, so this draft act has a very unique council that has been empowered to unilaterally and without any bureaucratic hurdles implement and advocate for persons with disabilities and all the laws regulating them, whether they're employment, educational or accessibility. So they don't have to go through rules and regulations each time and seek the government's approval.
I think the process is very streamlined that way. And in addition to that, I think we must also give credit to so many judgments that we've had over a period of time. Judges have actually gone to the extent of saying that, you know, the language that must be used when we refer to differently abled persons, that has to be very sensitive per se, on which I'll come to you, Dr. Saib. I think when we talk about all of us playing our role in this regard, healthcare professionals like yourself have a very important role to play. So what role can people like yourself in that position of power, of course, over people who come to you, play to sensitize, you know, the masses about the plight, or for that matter, about the issues of differently abled persons?
The main challenge that we have, Fatma, is that we feel that as a health professional, and when we talk to disabled person, that they feel that they do not have the same opportunities than normal people. So that is a huge challenge for them, because it is going to decrease their self-worth. More they are going to have a self-worth that is decreasing, more they are going to enter in a vicious circle, and more they are going to be isolated. More isolated they will be, less help they will be, you know, look for.
The society as
so
well.
Yes, so as a health professional, I think that we have a proper psychoeducative role where we have to not only help families but also normal people to make them sensible enough that we have to include those persons in our everyday life.
And I think in this regard, something which goes to the basics as well, I think the way you communicate with your patients, that is also very important, because, you know, unfortunately, I myself, you know, and I quote by way of example, have seen a lot of doctors be kind of a bit dismissive towards differently abled persons. So I think in that regard, doctors like yourself, you need to be more sensitized to, when we talk about sensitizing masses, you are also a very important part of the society. I'll come to you on that. You know, generally I have been, you know, following your social media, and I came across the fact that, you know, you've been very active on social media and so many other campaigns advocating for, of course, inclusivity in the society. So tell us about these campaigns, and tell us, of course, the potential of media, which must be used in a constructive manner to actually, you know, highlight differently abled persons like yourself in a positive light, rather than, of course, you know, downgrading them.
See, whatever campaigning I do, I feel like the more visibility I get, I want to show different people with disabilities who are sitting at home that, you know, anything is possible. The sky is limit, to just go to cliche. Because, you know, at the end of the day, what helped me when I went to England after my accident was seeing people in wheelchairs you know, going out, eating out, going to cinemas. At that point of time, I was in a very dark place, and I thought just I would be bedridden for life. And over there, I saw what kind of options I had. So I want to do that back home here in Pakistan, and it is so encouraging, Fatma, when I get messages from people, from mothers, from fathers, even people that, oh, you know, my son is disabled, and I showed him your video, and he was so impressed, and we were telling him that why don't you go out as well.
And this recent video which you did with a very known celebrity in Pakistan, I think that was phenomenal in the sense that, you know, how she got to feature. I think the credit also goes to that particular celebrity too, that she managed to, you know, actually get this pool together of so many accomplished women, and her idea of empowerment was so different from the typical cliched idea that we usually see people associating, you know, empowered women with. So I think that in itself is also very good. Tell us about that initiative too.
See, the video that I did, it was about real women who have lived their life in spite of facing all the obstacles and barriers which they face in their daily life. And the theme for my section was a warrior princess. So, you know, that in spite of everything, and I wear my scars very proudly, okay, I'm very proud of them. I don't want to hide the kind of struggle I had to reach where I am now. I mean, you see me on TV right now laughing and lecturing and everything. I wasn't like that initially when I had an accident. I was in a very dark place. So like I said before, when I went to England, it changed my perception about viewing people with disabilities, because I was a part of the society and I viewed myself like the other people viewed me. And very later on, I realized and I understood that, you know, you set the tone for how people view you.
And that is true for anybody, you know, be it for an able-bodied person, be it for a differently able person. And you have, I think empowerment is something which comes from the mind at the end of the day.
Exactly, it does. You know, you need to be strong. I know it's a very cliched word. People say, oh yeah, it's easy to talk about.
No, but it's so true.
But it is, you know, like I said, it's been a long struggle, but I did get here. So, you know, the point is to just persevere, do not give up, and do, you know, consider your life as a blessing. Take it as a miracle that you've always waited for.
And I think in this regard, you know, considering, of course, giving due credit to the campaigns that you've very actively been involved to, I think generally there needs to be this need in Pakistan's mainstream media, be it in talk shows, be it in dramas, that, you know, the way we portray differently abled persons, the narrative needs to be set right, that needs to be strong, that needs to be positive, that needs to be, you know, progressive at the end of the day, to which I'll come to you, Ali. I think we must also talk about the education system and education per se. What role can that play when it comes to, you know, inculcating this sense of empathy, inculcating this sense of acceptance for differently able persons in the country?
Right. So the draft act that I mentioned before, one of the most beautiful things about it is that it is prospective and not retrospective. What do I mean when I say that? Basically, all educational institutes, whether private or public, will have annual screening of children who may have disabilities. And when we say disabilities, we don't mean physical disabilities. We mean even things like ADHD or dyslexia or
maybe an intellectual disability.
Sure, absolutely. So all these forms of disabilities will be screened upon, so that prospectively children who may have such a disability may not grow with that same disability in the future. So we are actively trying to ensure that we have a better future for them. To the extent of persons with disabilities and how they're accommodated in educational institutes, as I stated, it's not going to be based on this rhetoric of separate but equal. We will have accessibility systems and technology as per the law and the letter and spirit and purpose of the act, to make sure that they are not only in an equal footing, but they are equally partaking in all the activities that able children
are. And this, I assume, would also include the fact that, you know, their access, like in terms of access to assistive technologies, to adaptive technologies, that would also be ensured, because, you know, what is the right of having such progressive laws at the end of the day when they can't be properly implemented?
Absolutely.
I think, Sana, you would want to add something to this from a real life narrative too.
Definitely, from the point of view of education, I was part of a child care commission that was mandated by Justice Mansoor Ali Shah. It is such a detailed document. We've tried to incorporate it in our petition as well, and Justice Jawad, and we are so grateful to him that he gave it the importance that it deserved.
To which you wanted to add something.
Sana mentioned a very interesting point, a dark phase of her life. She went to UK and she realized that, you know, people over there, they were treating you very differently. So I think over here society plays an essential role. Society, obviously we need to be strong, the disabled person need to be strong himself or herself, but society is going to give a very different lens to that perception, to that people. So I think living in the society, we need to play our role as well.
Right, Dr. Saiba, your point is noted, on which note I would like to conclude today's show. Thank you so much, Sana, thank you so much, Ali Saab, and thank you so much, Dr. Saiba, for being here with us today. Well, to conclude today's show, we generally spoke about the rights of differently abled persons in Pakistan. We also spoke about the positive social developments as they have evolved in the Pakistani society. One thing that remains to be seen is the fact that, we need to change our societal attitudes towards differently abled persons in Pakistan, because we need to understand the fact that, merely because of the fact that you have a disability doesn't make you a disabled person. It can also make you a differently abled person, and a disability per se should come as a strength. It should not be considered to be a burden. On which note, thank you so much for watching The Society. Until next time, take care and Allah Hafiz.